Okay, excellent. We are now on the record. We are here with Dr. Tim and Dr. Lydia McGrew, and we're going to talk about miracles. We're going to talk about gospel reliability. We're going to talk about epistemology, all sorts of fun stuff. This is a great treat for me. I've had both of you on here individually. We've had tremendous conversation before, and now we get the treat of having you both on at the same time. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Pat.
Yeah, so let's just start with some formalities for people who maybe haven't heard our previous conversations or read the work that you two have done. Let's just do some brief introductions. So, Tim, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Lydia.
Sure. I'm a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. I have now been there for 26 years, which is a long time to be in the same job, but that's great. Love my work, love teaching. I specialize in epistemology and the history and philosophy of science and probability theory and its applications. And increasingly in the past dozen years or so, I've been working in the philosophy of religion as well. So I kind of have quite a range of interests, and I get to indulge almost all of them because I get to teach the best stuff on earth.
That's right. Very generalist. Like we like that on this podcast. So excellent. Good to have you back, Tim and Lydia.
So I am a homemaker, and for a couple more days, a homeschooling mother. I'm actually finishing up my last homeschooling with my youngest child. But my doctorate is in English literature in 1995. Then I moved on to publishing in analytic philosophy, first co-publishing with Tim, then publishing on my own, specializing in the theory of knowledge and formal epistemology. And then in the last recent years, last 5 years or so, I've moved on to New Testament studies while keeping up my my probability and philosophy as well. So doing both of those. And so that's like 3 different fields academically that I've moved into, all of them in a somewhat non-traditional way: English, philosophy, and New Testament. So that's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to doing even more of that now as I'm moving beyond my homeschooling years.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. Well, the topic for this conversation, we're going to focus on an article that the two of you contributed to the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology. I usually like to have it in my hands when I have discussions with the two of you, but I didn't want to bring that on vacation with me because it's very heavy. Even just your contribution is very heavy in that volume. So it's a tremendous article. It's called the Argument for Miracles. So I thought, let's talk about this. Let's get it on the table. It's been a number of years since the two of you authored this piece. Give the outlines, maybe give a defense, talk about if there's anything you tweak or change about it, and then we can just let the conversation develop from there. How's that sound to you two?
Sounds great.
Great. So who wants to start this? Who wants to give the overview and discuss what the Argument for Miracles involves?
Sure, I'll go ahead and give just a very brief overview, and then we can get into some more of the nuts and the bolts as we go further. The principal contribution that this article makes is that it does something no one else had done in detail before. It takes different strands of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and it breaks them out and then puts them together in a form that makes use of probability theory. Richard Swinburne has done something like this on a more general scale with broad scale features of the universe and created like a nested cosmological, teleological, moral argument, etc., in the existence of God. But no one had gone into the details of the New Testament accounts of the resurrection and tried to lay out what that case would look like. So we first develop a mathematical framework using Bayes' theorem, and then we talk about different categories of evidence: the testimony of the women, the evidential value of the conversion of Paul, the testimony of the disciples, and so forth. And then we model all of that, and we talk about how the hypothesis that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead fares when compared to various rival hypotheses: the swoon theory, the stolen body theory, the legend theory, and so forth. So we make the case that from the data we start with, there is a powerful argument in favor of the resurrection. We don't go into the question of the existence of God. So that's a separate question in its own right. And in a way, most of the rest of that volume is a sustained argument for the existence of God based on multiple other considerations, and so other contributors are carrying some of that. So the net effect is that we don't conclude, oh, the resurrection has a probability of 99.99% or something like that. But what we do say is there's an extremely powerful case here. And that sort of shifts the burden of proof. If somebody wants to contest that, ball's in your court now. Come up with something that actually engages in detail with the argument as we've presented it, which is a more robust argument. It's an argument that makes use of a wider range of facts than is often done in these discussions or in debates. And it's an argument that fans out across a wider array of evidence. We do gladly take the responsibility for arguing that the Gospels are reliable to this extent, that they represent what people close to the facts said close to the time of the actual events. We don't say they're reliable in the sense that when they report miracles, they're right. We don't beg the question like that, but we do take it that these documents are written by people who were close up to the facts and were, I think it can be argued, habitually truthful. And so then you've got to cope with that fact, and you have to give an alternative account. If you don't like the miracle, and many people don't, then you have to engage with this on some other grounds. And we also engage some with Hume's famous critique of reported miracles in that article.
Yeah, very good. Lydia, is there anything you want to add to that? And then I just have one sort of stage setting question before we dive deeper.
Well, it was interesting what Tim just said about not automatically, saying, okay, they're reliable, so the miracle happened. There's a book that just came out, and I think I corrected this point when I was on with you last, Pat, but I'm going to say it again here because we're discussing our Blackwell article. The book just came out by Dale Allison, in which he is talking about the resurrection, and he has a few paragraphs where he critiques our 2009 article. And he gets something just wrong in his representation of it. He says that the McGrews assume the facticity of the gospel narratives, including the appearance to Thomas, for example, doubting Thomas. And so then he kind of dismisses that because it's so strong. Well, of course, obviously, if we said we're going to take it as evidence that it's factual that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Thomas, then that entails that Jesus rose from the dead.
You don't need an argument on top of that, right?
Right. That looks like question begging. Now, what we actually do is probably something that Dr. Allison would be no happier with. But what we do instead is that we assume that the accounts in the Gospels, including, for example, the appearance to Thomas, represent what the people who would have been witnesses claimed. So, for example, that you had the 11 there saying, and Thomas didn't believe it. And then a week later, he appeared, and Thomas is like, I didn't believe it. And then a week later, he appeared, and he invited me to touch his wounds and so forth. That this is what they were saying. And then what's the best argument, the best explanation for it? Now, I'm sure that Allison would reject that also, but I think it is an important distinction.
Right, because it helps alleviate the charge of question begging. So I'm glad you made that. That's very important.
Right.
Okay, the first thing, and you can let me know if this is too much of a distraction. We can set it aside until later. But I guess the first question I want to have for both of you is, one, how much work you think this argument can do and how much work you think it should do. So kind of an expectations thing. And part of that is on the existence of God question, right? Because one way of thinking about it is, okay, say somebody reads through the Blackwell Companion or whatever, right? Or for whatever reason, they already have a strong belief in God, right? They really just, they think that this is the best way of seeing reality. They're very confident that God exists. And then they encounter your argument, and it just seems like this is such a reasonable and responsible and befitting conclusion that, if I already believe in God, I should just accept Christianity. That's one way of seeing it, right? The other way is maybe they're agnostic or maybe even somewhat atheist, and they encounter your argument. Would you say that your argument still has enough force that it should then flip them on the question of God? You see kind of the two ways somebody might approach this? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say it depends on where they're coming from, and this in two respects. Number one, let's take someone who is an atheist, but not someone who thinks the very claim God exists is incoherent. illogical in the sense of logically impossible. Somebody who thinks, yeah, it's a factual claim, it's within the reach of evidence in principle, I just think the evidence is against it. So the first question we have to ask is, how much is the evidence against it in your judgment? Just how strong is the case against the existence of God? And you can get a whole range of answers here, some of them quantitative, some of them qualitative. The second question we have to ask is, even given what you know at present, is that level of pessimism rationally justified? So we have to know where the person's coming from in terms of what the person would say or what we could elicit about the level of commitment to atheism. And then we also have to explore the question of whether there are good grounds for that level of commitment. People tend to overlook the fact that atheism is itself a positive claim. It's the claim that there is not a God. Some people try to muddy the waters with this by saying atheism is just lack of belief in God. But we have a word for people who are unsure either way. That word coined by Thomas Henry Huxley, T.H. Huxley, is agnostic. And so for atheists to try to blend atheism with agnosticism is just a way of swelling the numbers. But if you're really an atheist, just be a man, come out and admit, no, I don't believe God exists. I think it's probably not true. But they overlook the fact that then you're making a claim. It's not the case that there's a God. And that claim is itself a claim that has to be evaluated in terms of evidence. When we've done that, I think what I would say is the argument from miracles puts pressure on atheism itself. You don't have to argue for the existence of God first in order to see that here is something that ought to at least bother you. Here's something incongruous with your worldview. And for some people, the argument might be strong enough that it would overcome their commitment to atheism and make them say, all right, forget it, I was wrong, there's a God. For other people, perhaps, and because I don't have a particular person in mind and we can't explore this, perhaps we could just grant for the sake of argument, yes, you're rational in being an atheist so far and given what you know. And maybe so strongly rational in doing that, that by itself, this argument, though it's irritating, might not move you all the way to theism. But fortunately, there are also good evidences for the existence of God. There are arguments from the origin of the universe, from the origin of life, from the origin of consciousness, as well as from the origin of Christianity. And so these kinds of considerations should push you to the point where you're more receptive if you were unreceptive. Also, I think some people fall into a sociological trap of thinking that because a lot of smart people are atheists, that must be a smart thing to do. And they don't really examine very carefully the evidences, or they examine them only for polemical reasons. Let me see if I can find some way around them. That's better than not examining them at all. But the best way of all is to look at the evidence with as open a mind as you can muster, read what can be said against you, and try to form a balanced judgment about this. There's some fun stuff that came up in a recent exchange I had with Graham Oppy, but we don't have to go there right now. We can maybe pick up on that a little later.
Yeah, and I definitely want to, because I want to talk about some of the exchange you had in your 4 Reviews book as we move along, but we'll just hang a lantern on that. Lydia, is there anything else you want to add to Tim's remarks there?
I would probably say fairly boldly that I think that it should flip a person, but who is an atheist, because I don't think the evidence for atheism is so overwhelming, and we argue for a really high Bayes factor, but Bayes factor being a measure of the strength of the evidence for the resurrection. I don't think that it's so strong that it couldn't be overcome by this. And I definitely want to push back on any kind of it's sometimes called a classical approach to apologetics that literally says you have to argue first for the existence of God. There's a real failure to understand probability there, that propositions that are positively relevant one way or positively relevant the other. So if the existence of God is positively relevant to the resurrection, then the resurrection is positively relevant to the existence of God. So if we've got independent evidence for the resurrection, then that's going to be ipso facto evidence for the existence of God. And I'm trying to bring some of these ideas of what's called epistemic routing into my video series on my YouTube channel and make them more familiar to people in apologetics, even skeptics as well. So I think it probably should flip people, but psychologically, sociologically, whether it actually will is a completely different question, and we have to not confuse those. So I think it's a very good idea to do a full court press, and bring in here the other arguments for the existence of God, and even more specifically for the existence of a good God. So like, what do we mean by God? Do we just mean a impersonal first cause or something? Arguments for the existence of a personal God, and so forth, that or even arguments from prophecy, for example. So that's a different one, for the existence of the God of the Jews, the God of Judaism, whom Jesus claimed to represent. He didn't just claim to represent some generic theism. So all of that, everything we can do in order to make it clear what the overall evidential situation is. And of course, that's certainly going to help.
Right. Yeah, that's excellent. And I hope the gentle listeners don't mind this stage setting stuff, because I think it's really important. Now, before we do dive deeper into the argument in terms of stage setting, is there anything else that you think needs to be done first? Do we need to address Hume first, or that naturalism is a simpler hypothesis? So let's just go with that. Or should we just dive right in? You two are obviously the experts on this, so I want to feel like you can steer the conversation as well.
Let me just say a word or two about the naturalism as a simpler hypothesis. This is something that comes up because people say, oh, I'm a naturalist. I believe in all the same physical objects and processes that you do, but your view has this extra baggage. You believe in God and angels and the Trinity and all this weird stuff, and I don't have to bother with any of that. So my view is simpler than yours. So I start out this little epistemic foot race with a head start. Right? That's basically the concept. And I'd like to push back against that. If I believe in A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you believe in A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and those are all entities that exist, but I don't say whether I believe in G. I don't add that one, but I don't deny it, then I'm committing myself to less than you're committing yourself to. But that doesn't mean that my view is better in all respects. It may be an explanatory catastrophe. So an example that came up in my exchange with Oppie is that, if you believe in the existence of all of the presidents of the United States, and I believe in all the presidents of the United States except for Abraham Lincoln, then my view cannot explain all the things your view can explain. Sometimes our views have ontological commitments. We commit ourselves to the existence of things, but there's perfectly good reason for that. And we would make an explanatory catastrophe out of US history if we tried to do without the existence of Abraham Lincoln. That's the first point. The second point is naturalism doesn't just say, I'm not invoking the existence of God. Naturalism says there's not a God. God does not exist. That is itself a claim, and that claim requires some justification. If you can explain all of the evidence that the theist brings forward with purely naturalistic explanations, and you can do it as well as the theistic explanation can do it, which I would absolutely contest. I don't think it's even close. But if you could, then that would push the question of the existence of God back to what we call the prior probability, the probability before we began considering the specific evidence. It would not push it to zero. It would not push it to the most unlikely thing imaginable. It would just push it to wherever that's left beyond the consideration of specific arguments pro and con. And Oppie seems to be treating it as though that's a slam dunk for the atheist. I don't think it is. That gets us into some complications. But the simplicity claim has to be tempered by the acknowledgement that the naturalist isn't just saying, I believe in these other things, full stop. He's also saying, and God does not exist. And that is itself a claim, and that claim requires some kind of substantiation. In the event, it doesn't matter as much as Oppie thinks, because I think he's wrong about the explanatory power of theism vis-a-vis naturalism, but I just want to get that sort of out in the open.
Yeah, I think that's important, because that's sort of Oppie's, at least Oppie's approach. Other atheists might have different approaches. He said we should prefer naturalism because it's simpler, and it can explain the data just as well. And in your exchange in the Four Reviews book, you say I disagree on both accounts, right? It's not simpler in the way that it's often presented to be, right? There is another commitment here that bears justification, and you would just say no, it does not explain the data. It lacks. It's extremely impoverished in terms of its explanatory power and scope, and both of those have always seemed ripe to me. And the types of naturalistic explanations, or the way the naturalist tries to get around the certain data that actually seems like it fits a lot better on theism, like a contingent universe or a finite universe or consciousness or a moral standard. Like, these are things that when I hear naturalistic explanations for them, they always seem very ad hoc. They don't seem to actually explain the things in question. Many times they don't even try to explain it. They try to explain it away, right? You have eliminativists and stuff like that. And the fact that you have these various different positions here that do not explain the things in the same way, they're often at odds with each other, shows that there is an extreme poverty here in terms of explanatory power. But I like what you do, Tim, because you don't even grant the first you don't even grant the first point. It's not even simpler in the way you think. So but I think it's important to realize, okay, even if it was simpler, it's just simplistic, and that's a problem, right?
Right. Let me say one other thing here, because this came out in an interesting way in our recent discussion, which is now up on YouTube. Oppie really does have to say, in order for his argument to go through the way he's presenting it, that every single piece of evidence is either better explained by the naturalist hypothesis or else a wash. It's either no worse than theism or positively better than theism at explaining every single piece of the evidence. That really worries me whenever I hear anybody say that about any complex issue, whether it be a historical hypothesis or what have you. Really, everything either favors your view or doesn't matter? Every single thing? Because I wouldn't say that about the existence of God. I would say that there are both moral and physical evils in the world, which, if you focus just on them, provide some evidence against the existence of God. So when I go to weigh up the evidence, I weigh those in the balance, and I consider them as well as considering the evidence that I think is favorable to theism. And I have to do a certain amount of thought about how much each kind of evidence weighs. It worries me when I see someone who can't see anything as evidence against his view on any complex topic. There are very simple topics, right? Does 1 equal 1? Yeah, fine. But that's, a priori. That's mathematics. Once we deal in the realm of history, then if somebody says nothing counts as evidence against my view, I worry that he's not looking at the evidence, he's looking at his view. Right. And he's very fond of it. But I certainly would not say that, nor would I say that all of the arguments ever advanced for the existence of God are cogent. I think some of them are not. So the ability to say there are arguments for the conclusion I like, but I don't think they're good, and there are arguments against the conclusion I would endorse, and I think they need to be considered as arguments, and they have some weight. I just happen to think that on balance, theism comes out much stronger. That seems to me to be the flexibility that I'm not seeing in Oppie's approach. And so that worries me. Go ahead, Lydia.
Yeah, so I have something I want to add here. I've done quite a bit of work on the issue of conjunctive and ad hoc explanations from a professional perspective, and not even related to philosophy of religion, theism at all, though of course it does apply. So I have an article on the existence of the external world, for example. I was just discussing conjunctive explanations with Irish probability theorist David Glass by email the other day, and this whole issue and of ad hocness and complexity. It's important to realize that there is a very deep connection between ad hocness and complexity, and therefore a very deep connection between prior probability and likelihood. So these are not even properly understood in the end. They're not even completely separate explanation or separate issues. So let's take, for example, the example Tim gave about believing in one president fewer, not believing in Abraham Lincoln. Suppose you actually did try to say either that you were a Lincoln atheist, a Lincoln skeptic, or an Lincolnist, or that you held it to be at like a merely 50% level of probability, like you were a Lincoln agnostic, okay, and that you thought everybody else should look at it this way too. You would then have to go to try, if you were honest, to try to account for the evidence that other people bring forward that supposedly shows that Lincoln did exist. In order to do that, in order to even make a stab at that, you would have to develop other auxiliary hypotheses, as they're called. So, for example, people being deceived, some gigantic conspiracy to cause us to think that there was an Abraham Lincoln and so forth. And when you have something that the person is misevaluating, as they would be if they were an Lincolnist, what ends up happening is that their ultimate explanation that then they're forced to develop ends up being more complex in the end and less simple than the hypothesis that Lincoln existed. So they're only looking at simplicity along one axis, one fewer president. And then they end up having to develop enormous complexity in a different area. For example, attributing intentions of deceit to other people, and attributing a lot of coincidence or something, that it's just coincidence that all these people happen to think that Lincoln existed when he didn't really. And so they're complexifying the hypothesis. And what we would argue then is that that's actually more complex. And so I think the same thing ends up happening for the resurrection. It's interesting that in Dale Allison's book, just it's on my mind because I've been reading it recently, he apparently, and this is another thing he faults us for, that we don't address the idea that thieves stole Jesus' body by, as I understand what he's saying, is by coincidence, okay, at right around the same time that the women had, it's not totally coincidence. The idea is that the women found the tomb empty, and then that kind of like triggered them to have to interpret their grief hallucinations, or whatever we want to call them, their apparitional experiences, as a resurrection because they had found it empty. But it is in a sense a coincidence that it was Jesus. Like, they might have stolen somebody else's body. These were thieves, as I understand the theory, that are completely unrelated to Jesus being Jesus, to his being this person who had predicted his resurrection, his being the person they thought was the Messiah. They were just thieves at work, and they happened to steal his body. And so he's really invoking the long arm of coincidence there, and he actually admits that. And he says, oh, well, improbable things happen in history, or that kind of thing. If he were to invoke this, he's always a little coy. He's not necessarily committing to this, but if he were a skeptic, this is the direction he would go. So I think that's an example of the kind of thing that I would say about the Lincolnist, and the kind of thing I would say about the naturalist, that it's not even like, oh, maybe it could possibly be simpler, but then it would be explanatorily impoverished. If it's explanatorily impoverished, when you then go to try to address that issue and fix that issue, it's going to end up not being simpler either, for that very reason, because those are actually united down at the root.
Right, because it might try to take care of one data point, but now we have all these other data points that are still left hanging, and then we're going to have to bring in different explanations for those other data points. Right.
There are more ways for a view to lose simplicity than simply by adding entities. And adding a bunch of contingent auxiliary hypotheses that require each on its own separate defense is one of those ways.
Yeah, excellent.
Or you could even call them entities. You could say the thoughts, the intentions to be deceptive could be thought of as entities. Or the thieves, in this case. Here are these grave thieves coming out of nowhere. They're entities, So very often you can even think of them as entities.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is all right. This is good. Are we ready to then start getting into the details of some of the argument, you think?
Let's do it.
The floor is both of yours, so take it in whatever direction you want. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So let me just sketch how this works in a general way for, I'll just pick one piece of evidence, okay? The Gospels report that the first people to the empty tomb were women. That's just what it's reported. Now, this presents an explanatory challenge for alternatives to the resurrection. If Jesus rose, then and if women in fact came, then that's something that might well have been reported. There's no reason for the Christian community to falsify that if he really rose from the dead. If, however, this were an account that were ginned up later, would we expect them to put women at the tomb? So one of the things that we do is we go back and look at Jewish conceptions of the testimony of women. And it turns out it's not a very favorable picture. Women are frequently considered to be either incompetent to testify in legal matters, or their competency is valued at some fraction of the testimony of a man. And this is a pretty widespread phenomenon, so we quote various Jewish sources indicating this. If you were trying to make up a story that you hoped would persuade people, if this were a propaganda narrative, putting women at the tomb would be like shooting yourself in the foot. In fact, when the skeptic Celsus in the late 2nd century goes after Christianity and attacks Christianity, that's exactly where he presses. He says, you've got a hysterical woman who starts saying crazy things, and then you all fall for it. Wow, that's not persuasive. He picks on her sex and on prejudices about her sex. So what does this do? This gives us a mismatch in the explanatory value of the hypothesis of the resurrection and the denial of it. The resurrection hypothesis accounts well for the data. The probability of this report, and again, we're not saying the report is true. It might be. We might argue for that in other ways, but here we're just saying this is in fact what was reported. The probability of this report, if the resurrection took place, is much greater than the probability if it did not.
And I just want to emphasize how important and modest and subtle that is, right? You haven't argued for that this report is true. You're saying just the fact that we have this report is better expected, better explained by this hypothesis than that hypothesis.
Right. And what it turns out is that it's not just the distance, as if you were to subtract one probability from the other, that matters. It's the ratio. So let's say the hypothesis that we'd have this report if really Jesus' body were discovered missing by women at the tomb before any men came. Let's say that's got a probability of 25%, but the probability that we'd have that report if they didn't has a probability of 0.25%. We're not left with 24.75% like if we did a subtraction. It's that ratio. So with the numbers that I just put in, that would be 100 to 1 ratio. And we pick some numbers, which we plug in for the purpose of our calculations. But the point of the calculation is to show that when you have a number of ratios like this, and each of them is top heavy, then prima facie, there is a accumulation of evidence that can be quite strong. And unless you can argue for certain kinds of dependencies among them, then the cumulative case may be staggeringly strong, even though it's built up out of little pieces a bit at a time like this. So you don't even need the probability that we would have these reports to be greater than 50% if the resurrection took place. It's the proportion that matters. That's what does the epistemic heavy lifting. And I find that there are entire books out there on theism and explanation. For example, Gregory Dawes has a book in which he argues that it's really hard to give an explanatory argument for theism because it's hard to be sure what would happen if theism were true. But that's not what matters in this argument. Let me give a non-religious example just to sort of show how we use this sort of reasoning artlessly every day. If I'm out hiking in the woods and I come upon what looks like an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, I may have very little hope that there is anyone actually living in it. I wander in, I push open that door, And sitting on a rude little table in the middle of the one room there is a freshly steeping cup of Earl Grey tea. It's still noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature, and it's like there it is. Now, I may not, before I push the door open, have had any very high probability that a dweller, if there was a dweller, would like tea at all, would prefer it to coffee, would choose Earl Grey if that were what he, all those things I may say, yeah, no, I didn't have any very strong argument for that, and I would have put the percentage pretty low. But however low I put it, it's orders of magnitude greater than the probability that there's going to be a cup of tea steeping like that if the cabin is uninhabited. And so I immediately know there's somebody there. Might not be in the cabin at this moment, but there's somebody who lives there and was there very recently and has just put this on. I don't have to say, oh, it was very much to be expected if the cabin's inhabited. I just need to say it's far more to be expected than if the cabin were uninhabited.
Right.
That's an illustration of the value of taking that ratio.
And I was just going to say, and that's important because we don't have to be able to assign a specific probability to make those kinds of judgments. Right.
Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to say something exactly about what you just said, Pat, because unfortunately, several, even some Christians, I've written an article in response to Tom Crisp, who was a friend of Alvin Plantinga's, who uses the term inscrutable, that a certain probability is inscrutable. And he does very much what Dawes does. Elliot Sober does something similar concerning the design argument, that if we can't assign separate probabilities for the separate parts of that ratio that are fairly specific, they'll say we just have no idea. But I think Tim's example of the Earl Grey tea shows that we don't have to be able to. It's not only that we don't have to be able to assign a high probability to the Earl Grey tea and the being hot and so forth. We don't really have a probability in mind. Sometimes we access the ratio tacitly better than we access the separate parts of the ratio. And that's so important. And in my article in response to Crisp, and in fact, other articles that I have out there, one on history and theism in the Routledge Companion to Theism on Elliot Sober, I make that same point, that we can access sometimes intuitively that this is a very top-heavy ratio, even when we don't have anything highly specific in mind. I wanted to say something about the women as well that Tim brought up. I think that is relevant to the dependence issue, because when the women came to the men and said they had seen the tomb empty, and then also that they had seen Jesus, it says in Luke that they didn't believe them. Although Luke doesn't tell about their seeing Jesus, but we know from Matthew and from John that they claimed to have seen Jesus. And it says they didn't believe them. Their words seemed to them as idle tales. And I think that's relevant because you will hear that, the experience of Mary Magdalene, whatever that was, if she had a hallucination, a vision, an apparition or something, it sort of set up Peter to have a similar experience, and then to interpret that experience. Like if she interpreted her experience as a resurrection or an experience of the physical Jesus, it set him up to have or interpret or both his own experience of the same kind. But if he didn't believe her, or if he was just like, what, even though it says in John that they went to the tomb, Peter went to the tomb and the beloved disciple, and they found it empty, even so, I think they're puzzled. And it says concerning the beloved disciple that he saw and believed. It's not clear what he believed. It doesn't say that about Peter. And so I think it's really a strong and implausible hypothesis. I mean, if you had a friend, who said that I saw this other friend risen from the dead and so forth, would that really set you up to have your own non-veridical, or shall we say, paranormal experience of that person, and then to interpret it as a physical resurrection when it wasn't really good evidence of a physical resurrection? I mean, maybe I'm just unusually tough-minded, but it certainly wouldn't have that effect on me. I would worry about my friend, So that's just true generally, but all the more so with women involved.
Yeah, really good. A lot of good points there. So just to summarize a few thoughts so far, and then we'll keep diving deeper, is that I want to emphasize again the importance of it not being a problem if we can't assign a specific probability, right? Because it's that ratio that matters. I mean, another example, like what is the probability, just thinking about God in the abstract, that he would create a universe with a finite causal history? I have no idea, right? I don't know. Like, maybe he has to, maybe he could have created an eternal universe, but it does seem quite right to me to say that that we find evidence for a universe with a finite causal history seems to be much better expected if theism were true than naturalism, right?
People pick up on that too. I recall one conversation I had with a young man who told me he was interested in Christianity, but he really wanted to talk about it. And when we sat down, I said, well, where should we start? He said, let's just start with the existence of God. And I picked up where he started. There's not really a point if somebody says that in saying, no, wait and see if my argument from miracles persuades you first. We'll start where you are. And I gave him one argument for the existence of God. We took maybe 20 minutes, half an hour. And then he looked at me and said, okay, let's go to the Gospels now. That was what it took to get him over the psychological / epistemic hump that he was facing. That got him out of that rut, and then we were able to move on. So yeah, I did not present it as something that was a guarantee knockdown. I presented it as evidence that points in one direction, that top-heavy ratio, and he got it. He saw it, and he said, "Okay, I'm ready to move on."
And I think that's good, because it's modest, and I think modesty is good because it gives people gives them a psychological room or space. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's just helpful in a lot of conversations too. And there's a great intuitive aspect to it. So sorry for emphasizing that point, but I think it's one that is so often overlooked, that it doesn't matter if we can't say for sure that God would have done it specifically this way, or that we have a 67% chance that God would have done it this way. That's not what we're saying at all, right? We're saying, what hypothesis is this better expected on? I think that the tea in the woods is great. Like, I have no idea whether somebody likes Earl Grey tea or not, right? But I know that if I discover a Earl Grey tea steeping in a house, that is far more likely, given the hypothesis that somebody inhabits that house, than it being completely abandoned, right? Good. Okay, so where are we going from here?
Well, I would emphasize something that we emphasized in the original article that I think doesn't get emphasized often enough. And I've seen people say, wow, that was just such a revelation to me. So I want to bring this out, which is what we're comparing is the probability of the evidence given R, that is a resurrection, and we mean a physical resurrection, to the probability of the evidence given not R. So we're just boldly going for what's an exclusive and exhaustive partition, as it's called, R and not R, because we want to say this is really strong evidence for the resurrection, not for the resurrection and something else. So we do that, and we emphasize that the most probable thing to happen if the resurrection didn't happen is nothing. And that is just such a revelation to people. It's easy to dive into highly specific things like the swoon theory or thief stole the body, really specific hypotheses that are intended to explain away certain specific parts of the data, or this person had a grief hallucination or something like that. And then you say, well, that probability is low, it's low. Or it's got these problems, it's got these other problems of prior probability and so forth. And at a certain point in our article, we say, well, so where is the majority of the probability? What is going on with the majority of what we call the probability space given not R? Well, the majority of the probability space given not R, the probability of these events is like down on the floor. It's nearly zero, because when most people die, nothing happens. Nobody's out there saying that they rose from the dead, and certainly most people are dying, and nobody's out there saying they physically rose from the dead. I mean, again, Allison loves his paranormal literature. All the people who say, I experienced a vision of my husband or my grandfather or whatever. But even those people are not attesting to the kind of physical experiences that lead them rationally to believe that the person is physically risen. It's like a message from beyond the grave or whatever, even if you buy that literature. So the likelihood of this evidence given Nadar is tremendously low. And one way we can see that is that hypotheses that would explain even a part of the evidence have low probability given not are. So suppose we get, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What's the probability that someone is going to have such a grief hallucination that they conclude that Jesus rose from the dead, or that a whole group of people are going to? Well, that's got low probability given that he didn't rise from the dead, enormously low probability. And that's what's driving this very high ratio. And it's like this with contingent arguments for the existence of God as well. The probability that we would have that we would have extremely detailed, apparently designed entities, given that there is no designer at all, just not D, I would argue is enormously low. Now that gets us into an entire, set of things about Darwinism and whatnot, but often that's what's driving it. And what's driving it is that we just wouldn't expect this at all, given the contrary hypothesis. So bringing that out and kind of taking the focus wide to the entirety of Nadar is part of what we try to do in that article. We do engage with specific intended alternative hypotheses, but then we keep emphasizing what a small part of the probability space under Nadar those alternatives occupy.
Yeah.
Let me illustrate what Lydia just said by reference to another messianic movement within Judaism that came to a head less than a century after the first disastrous Jewish war of the 60s, when Jerusalem was flattened, and that is the Bar Kochba Rebellion. Simon Bar Kochba, known as Bar Kochba, was a messianic pretender in the 130s, and he led a massive revolt against Rome. Rome did not, for the most part, enforce its rule by occupation. The empire was too wide, and they didn't have the ability to occupy every province with a massive number of soldiers. That would have required a standing army that would have been economically very difficult to sustain. Instead, they ruled by the threat of sending in the legions. Over on the eastern rim of the empire in Palestine, it was possible for a revolt to get started and gather some steam before Rome took enough notice of it to gather the legions and send them across the Mediterranean and land them and then go out and try to enforce it. And so the Bar Kochba Rebellion sort of had its first few successes in the early 130s, but by 136 it was crushed, and Simon ben Kochba, or Bar Kochba himself, was actually he holed up in a cave somewhere in Samaria and probably died there. So what do we say about this? Well, what happened? Nothing happened. In fact, people didn't even want to admit that they had known him. There were no grief hallucinations. There were no women coming in saying they had seen him. Nothing. There was no movement started. And he hadn't even been crucified, itself an especially shameful act. When a Jew is hung on a tree, this invokes the echoes of the Old Testament. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So nothing happened. People just went back to their lives, kept their heads down, hoped Rome would leave them alone at this point. That's exactly what you would expect. And that's a Jewish messianic movement in Palestine that got rolling about 100 years after the advent of Christianity. And exactly what Lydia just said is what we find, is that nothing happens. A way of stressing this is, and I'll repeat something that Lydia said here, that even if the resurrection didn't happen, the probability of these complicated auxiliaries, some unknown people stole the body, then for some reason some people had hallucinations, and for some reason some other people either believed those hallucinations or were triggered into having their own hallucinations, these are all improbabilities. Some people try to say, yes, but we do know that things do sometimes get stolen. in a naturalistic world, that people do sometimes have hallucinations in a naturalistic world, that people do sometimes misidentify people in a naturalistic world. And so any explanation that is couched purely in those terms must be better than your supernatural explanation. Why? Why say a thing like that? That seems justifiable only if you have put either the existence of God or the credibility of a reported miracle out of range of the evidence. And there's no justification for doing that. So we would just flatly deny that any naturalistic explanation, no matter how contrived, no matter how clumsy, must always be superior to any supernatural explanation, no matter how clean and elegant it may happen to be.
Right. Yeah. Excellent point. And I do want to come back at some point to coming through the criteria that you established for evaluating miracle claims. I think that will be very important. But one other thing I wanted to throw out there, and again, if this is too diverting, we can save it towards the end, would be, you mentioned the Old Testament was a Jewish context. It wasn't like Christianity and these reports just sprung out of absolutely nowhere. Right. Like, it wasn't like just some like isolated thing that, I mean, there were definitely surprising elements about it. Right. Nobody wants to deny that. But all this is happening in a tremendous religious context with tremendous expectations. Lydia already talked about arguments from prophecy, which I agree. Like, where are those? We need to bring those back. Like those, there's really power there. Is there anything we want to say about that before we move forward, of how important the general context is in the background? Mm-hmm.
I have a perhaps unusual point that may not even be where you were going with that, Pat, but sometimes skeptics will talk as though the Gospels show us people, the disciples, whose lives would not have had meaning if they didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So it's like these people, you know, they'd hung everything on him, and then their lives they would have nowhere to go. And I sometimes think there's a bit of a projection going on there, you know, that it's like, well, if you're a naturalist, maybe, you know, your life is meaningless without Jesus. But these guys were Jews, so they had a connection with God. They believed, you know, and the sacrificial system was still going on in the temple at the time. They didn't know that it was going to be ended in 70, you know, by the Romans. They really had something they could cling to. They could have gone back to being good Jews and looking for another Messiah. You even kind of see a little echo of this in the Emmaus Road conversation. They say something like, we had hoped that he would have been the one who would have redeemed Israel. Something like that they say to the stranger who turns out to be Jesus, who joins them on the Emmaus Road. What would they have done? They would have just, well, I guess he wasn't the one. And it would have been a tremendous disappointment, grief, and horrible and sad, but it would not have meant that their lives were completely meaningless. They've been with him for 3 years. Plenty of people recover from being with somebody for 3 years and then changing their minds and being disillusioned and so forth, particularly if you have another sort of meaning worldview behind you that you can stick with. So I definitely think that the Jewish context is important there, that they were not like just desperately searching for some way anyway to continue to say that Jesus was the one, to the point of either lying or making up experiences they hadn't had, or having, you know, these crazy detailed hallucinations. And I think that's an important use of the Jewish context.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. So very good. Okay, so we already have the one report, right? The report of the women. How else do we want to develop this? Where else do we want to go from here? Mm-hmm.
So I would want to talk about the other reports. You know, we've got Peter, and this is something that perhaps I would do a little bit differently now. As far as independence, I would emphasize the variety of the different reports, even when they involve some of the same people. So, for example, you've got the first appearance where it's supposedly the 11, or actually it's 10 because Thomas wasn't there. And then you've got the alleged appearance in Galilee in Matthew. You've got a different alleged appearance in Galilee in John. It's a completely different set of circumstances after they've been fishing. You've got Peter saying that he had an experience alone, although we don't have details of that. By the way, I think that itself is evidence of veracity, because if they were going to embellish and make stuff up, if I were going to embellish and make stuff up, that's the direction I'd go. I'd be like, hey, let's tell the story of how Jesus met Peter alone, but they don't do that. But he said that he did. So we've got James supposedly seeing Jesus, but again, we don't have details of that. We've got the doubting Thomas experience in Jerusalem. So you've got all these different experiences with partially overlapping, partially separate. We've got different women, like, for example, a group of women supposedly saw Jesus, and then Mary Magdalene supposedly saw him alone. We've got all this going on. And then I want to add the persecution context. So that's something we did in our original article that I still do today. I do it all the time. It gets disregarded in a way that is epistemically irresponsible. There's a place in that same place where Dr. Allison criticizes Tim's and my approach, where he says, well, I wonder what a Bayesian analysis would look like for the rainbow bodies claims concerning gurus in Buddhism, who supposedly their bodies turn into rainbows after their death. They dissolve, and they either completely disappear or they just leave their hair and fingernails behind. And when I first told Tim about that, he said, "Oh, I welcome that. Bring it on, man." And a big part of that has to do with that context of persecution. Dr. Allison is very reluctant to consider that people may be lying. I find that to be interesting. People do lie. I mean, that it's a known thing. It does happen. And I think he considers that that's, too easy. But at the same time, when there's absolutely no penalty, nothing's going to happen to you. And think of Elvis sightings, for example. If you say, I saw Elvis, what happens to you? Maybe some people make fun of you or something, but maybe you also get interviewed by the National Enquirer or something. Mm-hmm. So what they had every reason to anticipate. I would say, actually, initially, they probably could anticipate they'd be stoned to death. I'm not sure that they necessarily anticipated the specific ways that they eventually, many of them died, but Stephen was stoned to death fairly early. Jesus was almost stoned to death twice and almost thrown off a cliff. That was a third time. So this kind of, lynching, stoning lynching, I think they may have anticipated. Also, the Jewish leaders had just conspired with Pilate and succeeded in getting Jesus crucified. Maybe they could do that again. It had only been 6 weeks earlier, so that might have happened again. So I think they had every reason to anticipate some really bad stuff happening to them in that very early context. And that is part of what makes what we call the Bayes factor so powerful in favor of the resurrection for this wide variety of people who are willing to go out there and stick their necks out to say that Jesus was risen from the dead.
Yeah, all this stoning, they must have really wanted to cure epilepsy back then. Is that
or weeded out of the gene pool?
Obviously, hopefully the sarcasm was detectable there. So yeah, no, this is really, really good stuff. And I just want to remind people the general scheme is, what would you expect, right? Where is the degree of expectation more favorable here? Is it on R or not R? And just constantly keep that in the back of your mind as this is being developed. Tim, is there anything else that you'd want to add to what Lydia developed there?
I mean, that's really another critical point. I think that something we need to consider is that when you begin Scotch taping together improbabilities, the probability drops like a stone. You've got something that's only one chance in 100, but you say, hey, you know what? Strange things happen, I'll go for it. And then there's something that's one chance in 1,000, and you say, yeah, but you know what? Let's do that. And if these are not things that help each other out, then you've just taken on, a one chance in 100,000 set of sub-hypotheses, and it just falls. The other thing about the hostile context, this is something that came up actually in an exchange that I had with Bart Ehrman. He tried to bring up some of the stories about a Jewish sage, the Baal Shem Tov, and some of the miracles that were attributed to him. And I just said, okay, where's the hostile audience? And Ehrman was completely flat-footed. But this is something that Christians have been saying since Hume's lifetime. There are a lot of miracle reports out there. Few, if any, of us want to believe them all. So let's start putting up a filter. Let's say, are they reported around the time that the miracle is said to have occurred, or only much, much later, like all the stories about Pythagoras that were developed, centuries after his death? Are they reported in the place where the events are said to have occurred, or only far, far away? Well, over in India, some things happened, but, here are your readers in Rome. They can't go and check those out. Are they reported in such a way that they would not have been allowed to pass without examination when originally reported? A hostile audience is of great help there. And so those are just three filters that we can look at. Failing on one of those filters doesn't mean the report has to be false, but it's a reason for doubt. The resurrection of Jesus passes those three filters. And so we have to look at it more seriously than just some randomly selected miracle, either out of, say, the Hindu tradition or out of ecclesiastical history. There are some of the miracles reported from the Middle Ages where they were circulated in contexts where people might have been predisposed to believe them. That doesn't mean that they can't have happened, but it's a reason for doubt. So just be even-handed on this. The resurrection is really the hinge of Christianity.
Right.
And it's not easy simply to dismiss it unless you say, well, here's one more criterion. If it's miraculous, dismiss it without further investigation.
Yes.
And that is something that Hume does suggest in his famous essay, but that's also a move that leaves you without an answer to the crucial question: if I am wrong, how am I going to find out?
Yes.
Once you come to the point of just dismissing everything that you could reasonably expect as evidence if the event actually occurred, then if you are wrong, you've fallen into a kind of trapdoor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You can go in, but you can't get back out once you've done that. You have to repudiate the principle in order even to be able to change your mind.
Right. Tim, that reminds me to come back to the exchange you had in your Four Views book, because sometimes what happens, and this is, I think, a suggestion that Oppie has made, is that there's a sort of guilt by association with miracles, right? Well, you guys claim a miracle, but look, Mormons claim a miracle, and this seems untenable here. So, just try and take the whole project down by just finding some examples which I would agree, that are untenable or can be ruled out of being a reasonable or responsible belief. But Tim, and I'll let you speak for yourself here. You say, no, we have to be a little bit more thorough than that. We have to, there's majorly relevant differences here between, what we have on the scene that supports the resurrection versus, say, Joseph Smith. And I don't know if you just want to talk about that in general at all. I think you've kind of already set the stage with your criteria of filters, but anything else you want to add? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I don't want to go too far into the Mormonism thing, because that's really a large topic of its own. But if you look at the Deseret Weekly from 1894, this is issue 48, there's a report about some testimony that Joseph Smith's brother William gave at the very end of his life, just very briefly, a short time before his death. Somebody asked him, hey, tell us more about the golden plates. Did you see them? Well, I saw the box they were in, but I never saw the plates. Well, why not? Well, there was like a boy's frock that was cast over them, and we asked if we could remove it, and he said, no, I'm not allowed to let you do that. And so, you start to look at the evidence that even his own family members gave, and it just isn't very convincing at all. It's all bottlenecked at Joseph Smith's word for it. And even some of the witnesses who said, oh, I saw the plates later when they were asked, did you see those plates with your naked eye? Paused and said, well, I saw them with a spiritual eye. That's not the kind of shifting that the original witnesses of the resurrection gave. Right or wrong, they were bolder than that. And the way that they did it certainly put their necks on the line. It certainly was out of step with Judaism. I mean, Jesus was not the kind of guy to just sort of piggyback on the Judaism of his time. The Jews had extensive and elaborate regulations on how to keep the Sabbath. By their reckoning, Jesus broke them frequently. The Jews had an exclusive national relationship to God. Jesus taught that the franchise was now being thrown wide open and that they would come from the east and west and sit at Abraham's table. Wow, this is not the way to win friends and influence people if you're just trying to curry favor within the Jewish subculture. So there's a lot of hostility that Jesus' teachings quite naturally generated. And when we're told that hostility was there, look at the indirect evidence just of the epistles of Paul, where there are, and even of Peter, where there are many, many references to enduring persecution and suffering. Those letters were written to someone. If there's nothing in their experience that they are meeting that calls for these admonitions, then they'd really look quite strange. It's obvious on a dispassionate analysis that the writers of those letters believed that the people to whom they were writing were in fact experiencing persecution, and that's only what you would have expected in the nature of the case. So that criterion of a hostile environment is absolutely crucial and really does a lot of work in clearing away the clutter of other miracle claims. And when you see stuff like what Joseph Smith was able to do with golden plates and nobody's actually seeing them with their naked eyes, or the rainbow bodies that Dale Allison is fond of mentioning, where he's admitted that he's tried to reach out to some people about these, but as he puts it, they're somewhat shy. They're a little coy about talking to the outsiders about this. The early Christians were not coy about talking to outsiders. Mm-hmm. They went out on the street corners and proclaimed Jesus risen.
Yeah.
So there's just really no comparison there.
And that's a key, right? You can't just dismiss this without actually rolling up your sleeves and looking at the
exactly
right. Mm-hmm.
Not only can you not dismiss it, but you can't treat it as moderately interesting. So I find this kind of interesting. Tim and you have both been talking about the skeptic, the person who wants to just dismiss the whole thing. There's another way of approaching it that I have thought of only since we wrote our article and become sort of aware of since we wrote our article, which is that you're sort of edgily agnostic about everything. Okay. And this is very much the Allison approach. So you've got all these other claims and you don't totally dismiss them. And you've got the resurrection. You don't totally dismiss it either. But what's common to that and the more totally skeptical approach is that you make an epistemic move where you claim to bring the strength of the evidence for these claims to be relatively comparable. Okay, that's what's common, is that you deny that there's any strong difference in evidential strength. And then after that, you can choose to go a variety of directions. You could be, after you make them all more or less on a par, you can be skeptical of all of them, you can be credulous of all of them. But the one thing that has supposedly been ruled out is believing Christianity and not believing in a bunch of these others. And I find that there's a faulty concept of even-handedness here and fairness, that people will say, oh, he's so even-handed. It's like, so what you mean by that is that he's agnostic about everything and he treats everything as being on a par. I mean, what if I were just as confident or almost as confident of the existence of Robin Hood as of the existence of Abraham Lincoln? That wouldn't mean I'm being even-handed. It would mean I'm either under evaluating the evidence for Abraham Lincoln or over evaluating the evidence for the existence of Robin Hood. So that's not even-handedness. And so you can actually get, Tim talks about what would convince you that you're wrong. You can actually get this kind of at a meta level. What would convince someone that he's wrong, that the evidence is different? that the evidence is stronger? What would convince you that you're wrong about the epistemic situation? And that's where I think we need to be emphasizing both the details of the account, and that's something that we do in our Blackwell article, and that's something that we've emphasized way more in the years since then too, that we've got to have like the details where they said they touched him and so forth. So they would really have to be lying if this didn't happen. The details of the account and the hostile audience, those two put together tend to really distinguish the Christian evidence very strongly from these other accounts.
Yeah, I don't want to get too ad hominem, I guess, but it has always struck me as interesting. This it's not restricted to these debates by any means, but this sort of virtue signaling humility. She was saying, right? Like, yeah, I see you guys smiling, so you know what I'm talking about, right? Where it's like, this like pseudo pretense of just being even-handed, but it's always struck me as, no, I think you're just being lazy at the end of the day, or you're not really considering the evidence, but it's kind of giving off this impression that people want to do, especially like, people in academia, right? Of just being, being even-handed, but that to me isn't a virtue, right? The virtue is rolling up your sleeves, looking at the evidence and saying what you really think is the case, not just trying to please a certain culture because this is just what the culture kind of, I guess, favors at the time. I don't know if you want to pursue that route at all, or
no. I think here's where I think it springs from in this debate. And I don't know about in other analogous debates, but in this debate, I think it springs from critical scholarship concerning the Gospels. Okay, so if you really think that these accounts are embellished significantly, or that scholarship is cast, put a great big, I'm going to make my question mark backwards if I'm not careful. There we go. I got it right. I think that's a forward question mark. Put a great big question mark over the accounts in the Gospels, then it looks more even-handed, right? And you can actually believe that you're being even-handed by doubting the resurrection, because you say, well, we don't know how long after these accounts were written. We don't know if they represent what the witnesses really claimed. In fact, they probably don't. We don't know how much has been added because the authors thought that would make a good apologetic case and so forth. So when you cast all that doubt behind the accounts, then it does make the case look a lot more similar. And if you're just going to take that as a given, like this is the consensus of scholarship, then you're going to go out there, you're just going to hammer on people. Why are you accepting Christianity and not accepting, the rainbow bodies or whatever? Because you've cast so much doubt on the way that these accounts really represent what the witnesses claimed. So I think that's part of what's driving it. And that's one reason why in all the years since then, okay, so our original article was not that sort of minimal facts approach. I've talked about this in a lot of other places. And then in all the years since then, what have Tim and I most done? We've poured ourselves into evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Right. And then it all kind of hangs together, because that's then supporting what we took as a given in that original article. And then some staff is going to say, see, this was just confirmation bias. But we've actually found that it holds up remarkably well. And we know more now even than we did then, that it really does hold up extremely well, that these are the claims that the people close to the facts actually made.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a bit, because it's again, it's a modest thing. You're not begging the question. You're saying that these are the claims, and what hypothesis better predicts or explains that data, right? But now somebody might just try and undercut that and say, yeah, they're claims, but they're actually far removed, right? And they try to try and put a certain distance there to bring in a degree of skepticism around the entire project. So what do we want to say about this then? Because that does seem like something that is worthy of being addressed. Because at this point, I think hopefully the case has been made. Like, okay, if we do have these reports, and these reports are generally reliable in the sense that they meet the criteria that Tim has established, we've got a powerful case here. Like, we have a powerful case. So it seems like the skeptic is going to have to probably do what you just said, Lydia, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to have to try and undermine the general reliability by putting that distance in there. So yeah, let's take that up. Unless there's anything else that you want to say prior to that.
That's good.
Yeah, no, this is good. Let's just start by saying that it is quite right that the center of gravity of so-called critical New Testament scholarship is somewhere much more skeptical than we are. They do not take these documents to have been written by the people to whom they're attributed. They do not take them to have been written by anyone who had met Jesus personally, or even had probably met those who had met Jesus, perhaps at the margins. But this is actually a kind of modern scholarly conceit that I think can't really withstand close examination. From time to time, we encounter people who try to say, well, you guys just don't understand. There's a synoptic problem. Yeah, right. We've both known about that since our college days. That's not really the same issue as the issue of whether these are written by people who are close to the facts and habitually truthful. The evidence for the authorship of the Gospels is evidence that would leave no doubt in any non-religious field. It's far better than the authorship of a lot of other Greek historical documents. So this is really an area where we are quite willing to push back against the reverential submission that some people make to current consensus. There's an important point here about experts and evidence. When people have expertise in a field, they have invested a great deal of time, they've learned languages, they've read a lot of things. That's all good. That's fine. And it's one thing to respect their learning and to be willing to read their works to find facts that you were unaware of. Facts. Their opinions and their judgments are not necessarily worthy of the same level of deference. If you look at the opinions of historical Jesus scholars, even about who Jesus was, you find they're all over the map. Was he a failed apocalyptic prophet? Was he a cynical sage? Was he high on hallucinogenic mushrooms? People have proposed the widest possible range of things, and these are people who have studied the languages. And all right, at a certain point, we look at the variety of things being said about Jesus and we say, talk to me about facts, give me a new reference to the Second Temple Jewish literature, and I'll go read the reference. Facts are fine. Opinions, those I take much more lightly. C.S. Lewis says in one of his essays, I admire the learning of the great biblical critics. I am not persuaded that their judgment is equally to be respected. And that's exactly where we've come down. We are willing to learn facts if they really are facts and not just opinions dressed up and dogmatically stated, from anybody who can point us to the references, and we'll go back and we'll read those things. But what they do with them isn't a matter of learning alone. And sometimes it can be so filtered through the preconceptions, through what the Guild of New Testament Scholarship is willing to consider as something permissible, right? Thus far, but no farther, that it takes people who are in that respect outsiders to come in to look at the facts and to say, you know what, the things that you guys are saying, the conclusions you're drawing from these facts are not well justified by the facts.
So I want to just say a couple quick things here because, I've written 3 books on the reliability of the Gospels, and we've done interviews about them and brought in, some of these amazing types of evidence, incidental, external confirmations, many of which I got from Tim. He's really the man with the incidental, external confirmations, and internal evidences and so forth, that the Gospels are written by habitually truthful people and that they're close to the facts. Just overwhelming evidence. And then I would also emphasize the patristic evidence of authorship as well, which I think needs to be taken very seriously. But let's look at it at the big picture level. First of all, I want to talk about an author named Jörg Frey, who wrote a book in 2018 and about the Gospel of John. And one of the things he says there that's just so fascinating is that he says it doesn't matter how many of these other evidence, and I think he's thinking of external evidence there, like geography and archaeology and that kind of thing, are brought up to show the veracity, the truthfulness of John. And it's just astounding. What do you mean? And he says, because basically they could be merely added to give fictional credibility to the account. So could be then becomes enough to dismiss this. It's a poor hypothesis anyway, because many in John's audience wouldn't even have been able to verify many of these facts. Like it was released almost certainly in Ephesus in Asia Minor, and would they have known that Cana in Galilee existed, or be able to go over there and
they couldn't
verify.
Just pull Wikipedia real quick, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's a poor. The hypothesis has poor explanatory force anyway, but it also shows the kind of closed-mindedness that is endemic to the discipline, and that's what Tim was talking about. The other thing, big picture thing, I kind of want to address is this interesting tension you get between two different views of the gospel authors. And I think people should recognize that although these both are somewhat skeptical views, they don't play well together. So if you're switching back and forth between one and the other, pick one. So one of these is a kind of a cynical hoaxer view. And in a way, I would say Fry, maybe he wouldn't like that way of categorizing it, but what I just paraphrased from him kind of goes in the cynical hoaxer direction. That and so skeptics you'll hear say this. Bart Ehrman has said this. The Christians believed that they were allowed to make stuff up because it furthered their ideological cause. So he'll just come right out and say that. Okay, then this idea that they were allowed, and so then they'll use, like in John, it says these things are written that you might believe, and in Jesus, and believing you might have life through his name. And the skeptic will put his finger down on that and say, see, so he considered that he was justified in making stuff up. Well, it definitely it doesn't say that, but that's one view, that the authors are trying to make it look like they're giving real history, but they're not, and they're making it up, but they're doing it in this very clever way. Then the other view is the genre view, which is becoming increasingly popular sometimes in skeptical circles, sometimes in even Christian circles, which is that their audiences didn't really expect them necessarily to be telling the truth. Their audiences would recognize this as partially altered or would expect it to be. And also this huge generalization about ancient people. Ancient people didn't care as much as we do about the literal historical truth. And so, if anything, I would say it's the other way around. We're the ones who have biopics. We're the ones who have alternative history, mini-series and so forth, but we're the ones who are so cynical about our journalists. And yet even we get angry when we find we've been lied to. So notice, though, that these two views don't go well together at all. Mm-hmm. Okay, the cynical hoaxer view assumes that the audience did believe it. Mm-hmm. The genre view that says, well, it was all okay for them to make stuff up because that was expected at the time, assumes that the audience didn't believe it, and that they weren't going to be taking people and they weren't going to be deceptive. Pick one. And so I would say if someone wants to challenge the view that we're putting forward and that we've argued for, Tim, in many, many lectures, me in my books and so forth, they need to choose a univocal position and decide, do you want to make out that these guys were incredibly clever hoaxers, or do you want to make out that the audience was so out for just entertainment that they really were fine with it if they made up Jesus eating fish or whatever? And then we'll argue against that one. We'll argue against either one, but we need to know which one we're arguing against, and don't shift back and forth between them.
Right. It's not that we're not willing even to take on both views.
Oh, absolutely.
But they really don't sit well together. And so if you want to sort of split your probability space and say, well, there's some possibility of this and some possibility of that, fine, we'll take that on. But what we find quite often is that people shift back and forth between, that was just putting one over on the audience, and but this doesn't matter because the audience expected it. All right. Now there we really do have the right to demand that you make up your mind. Yes. If you're shifting back and forth between them as seems most convenient on a given occasion, wow, give me the ability to do that, and I'll undertake to defend all manner of crazy hypotheses just by picking and choosing which one I'm going to stand on in a given moment. People who do that are slippery, and they may think that they're scoring points because they always have some place to shift. but actually there's not a single consistent position lying behind it. And that's, I think, what Lydia's pushing on
Yeah,
here.
and that's an excellent point. And I know we both of you individually have come on to discuss gospel reliability before, so don't feel that we have to repeat all the points. We've talked about, of course, the proximity criteria, the interlocking undesigned coincidences, which again actually kind of comes back to degree of expectation. Like, what are the chances that we would find things like this, or even be able to make this case if one of these skeptical hypotheses were true? And it just seems very improbable, right? So I like what you said before, Lydia, that like it all just hangs together so well if we just stick to the traditional belief, the traditional hypothesis that the miraculous really did occur, right? It just explains all the data. It explains it in a really simple way, I would argue. And it's also a great and beautiful thing too. I know that's maybe is a secondary consideration in some respects, but I mean, like all else equal, like even if it was like a stalemate, right? The one hypothesis is just so beautiful and so hopeful, and it just seems so much more attractive that if I were just like 50-50, I'm definitely going with that, right.
I think you're looking at the elegance of a hypothesis, and that is itself a consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in a way that's sort of the flip side of what someone like Graham Oppy is trying to do with naturalism. He thinks naturalism is more elegant, and he likes it, and he thinks it is at worst 50-50, and then he's going to go with the more slender, ontologically less committal hypothesis. And I have problems with that, as we already discussed. But really, when you've got two hypotheses and you say, well, this one does the job neatly and cleanly, and that one does the job with a whole lot of kludging of stuff together, I'm gerrymandering my alternative to try to come up with something that will somehow manage to cover all the bases, we react to the ugliness of that hypothesis in something like the way that a modern astronomer reacts when he flips open a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest and he says, oh, wow, look at all these epicycles on epicycles. Isn't there a cleaner way of doing this? And of course, there is.
Right, yeah.
Let me try to take your point about it's being beautiful, Pat, in maybe a slightly different direction. Suppose that God did exist. Okay, we're going to take that hypothesis for a test drive, and suppose that he wanted to reveal the doctrinal commitments of Christianity. That man is a sinner, but man can be forgiven. That God wants to have a personal relationship with human beings and all these things that are part of core Christianity. What would he have to do to make that known? And so I find that sometimes skeptics will say, well, this isn't good enough as evidence, that they want God to like show each person personally, I don't know, something written in the stars or whatever. And they keep putting it, in a sense, beyond the reach of evidence. And one way I've put it is that if God really did want to reveal that Jesus was the only way to heaven and so forth, he would just be out of luck. Because basically what various skeptics and liberal scholars and so forth are saying is there's no way to do that because this evidence isn't good enough. But if you imagine God as existing, then I think you can think about the question of historical revelation, that really the most elegant way for him to reveal all these wonderful truths that human beings really do need to know that are very beautiful, as you said, Pat, would be to send a person and have this person teach those truths, right? I mean, Jesus is out there, he's teaching for 3 years. We've got all this content, all this theological propositional content. And then to have that person die and raise that person from the dead as a way of showing that it is true. Now, that's only one part of who Jesus was. He wasn't just a prophet. There's also he was a sacrifice for sin and so forth. But at the moment, I'm just talking about, verifying that propositional content. So suppose God had this beautiful propositional content he wanted to tell us about. What more could he do? What more straightforward way could he do it than by giving us a special revelation, a person who's teaching this to us, and then showing that that person really does come from him? And in the nature of the case, that's going to take place at a certain place in a certain time. And there are going to be some people who are going to be closer to it, and some people are going to be farther away from it, and so forth. And then those people are going to have to tell other people. And so then we find ourselves 2,000 years later, and also obviously not the original witnesses, and having to evaluate it. But that's just in the nature of the case, that he had particular truths to reveal, and he had to reveal them at a particular time. And so at that point, the beauty of the truths could make us say, okay, what if God wanted to tell us this? I would want to know it. I would want to hear it. And so I need to fairly consider the claims, the historical claims of this to have been revealed at that place and in that time.
Yeah, that's excellent. By the way, for people who have not read your original article yet, it is in the Blackwell Companion, which I'm going to link in the show notes afterwards. But I did link the PDF that you have for free on your website, and it's you have to read it if you want to get the most out of this conversation. You do have to read the full article. Obviously, we're just kind of getting the general sketch out there. You two have both already been exceedingly generous with your time, but is there anything else you want to say about anything we discussed so far? And if we have a couple extra minutes, maybe we could take some questions.
I do want to say there's the one sentence, and I always say this, the one sentence in our Blackwell article that I wouldn't put in there now, and that's the statement that the majority of scholars would grant that this is what the original witnesses claimed. We put that in our original article. We would take that out. That turns out not to be true. The majority of scholars wouldn't grant that, and so much the worse for the majority of scholars. As you can see from what we're doing here, we're not backing down from the claim. At that time, we did not realize just how skeptical the majority of scholars were. So that is a correction that I would make to the original article, and if you go read it, you should know that.
Good. Well, that is, we as always appreciate that. That's very important, and it's a marker of, which was never in question, but the intellectual virtue that the two of you have consistently demonstrated. So very good. What do you say we take some questions if anybody has any from the audience? Are you two okay with that?
Sure.
Sure. I'm gonna stop my camera for a moment, and I will be right back.
Sure. Yep. Do we want to do? We could do a couple minute break, or how are you feeling, Tim?
If you want to take a 2 or 3 minute break, we can do that. Sure.
Let's do it. I can put on. Let's just do it. So gentle listeners, if you're live, you have any questions, submit them now. We will be back in 2 minutes. I'm just gonna put this pretty background on the screen, so we'll see you then.
I'm back. Did I not unmute?
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. So excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, let's take a few questions here, and then we will make sure that the gentle listeners know where to get all of your the wonderful work that you two have put out. Okay, so let's see what we got here. First off, we just have a number of compliments. The McGrews rock. I certainly agree with that. That's why I love having them on the podcast so much, right? Just very thorough, just incredible people to chat with. So again, thanks to both of you for making time to do this. This is really a treat. All right, here's a question. Callum says, let's assume the existence of God and the soul are at least as likely true as false, all right? So, 50-50. How would the McGrews think the prior probability is, not necessarily focused on a specific number? I think they mean of the resurrection. Of the resurrection. If that question makes sense. Oh, I see he reworded it here. Sorry. So he just says, assuming the existence of God and a soul or is likely, true as false, how would the McGrews think what would the McGrews think is the prior probability of the resurrection?
Right. So let's split this question into two parts. How likely is a miracle of some kind? And how likely is it that it would be a resurrection? The first question, I think, can be answered like this. If we're assuming that the existence of God is at least, well on the table for discussion, and that we're talking about the kind of God who would have some important message to convey to us in a way that could not reasonably be mistaken as merely high-flying poetry, a fine philosophical statement, but was something that could really not come from man or nature alone, then a miracle is pretty much inevitable. And this is a point that William Paley makes in the preparatory considerations to his book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity, which everybody who is interested in these matters ought to read. Very few people remember Paley these days for anything more than his natural theology, which was an interesting work of its time. But I think the Evidences is a work that we really need to recover. So the second question then is, all right, if a miracle is nearly inevitable given the existence of a God who wants to give us a message that is certifiable as coming from God and not from man, then how likely is the resurrection? And here I think the answer is not very unlikely. Resurrecting a prophet is a way of putting a seal on his ministry that's very dramatic. That's really hard to get around. But there might be other miracles one could do that would also do the job. The resurrection, though, is really special in the sense that of all the things that you can fake, getting crucified by professional killers and then coming back from the dead is really a hard sell. David Copperfield has done some magnificent illusions, but traveling to Mecca to get caught and killed by an angry mob of Muslims, because you're not allowed to enter Mecca if you're not a Muslim, and then coming back from the dead, this is not one that he's tried, and I don't think he's rushing out to try it. So that's really got a kind of special status as the very, very hard to fake, probably not going to try this at home kind of miracle. So not very unlikely. Maybe there are some other ways that God could have done it, but this one's kind of right up there near the top of the list of ways of certifying, all right, this person, this message, this is the one that you need to listen to.
Notice that what Tim is talking about there is the conditional probability of the resurrection if God exists. And then the stipulation in the original question was that the probability of God exists is only around 50%. So you're not going to end up with the probability of the resurrection then being above 50%, because even if the probability of it, given the existence of God, were 1, which Tim isn't saying that it is, the probability of the existence of God is only being stipulated at 50% anyway. So it can't be higher than 50% anyway. So
well, but then we get the contrast class, though, right? What's the probability of the resurrection given not just the existence of God, and then contrasting that with the non-existence of God, but also giving all the specific evidence.
Okay,
and
that's exactly
where it all changes.
That's where I was going to go next. The word prior here is a little ambiguous because what if you had followed, the whole history and evidence for the history of the Jewish people, and so you've got Isaiah 53, for example, that says he was cut off from the land of the living, and then it says he will see his seed and he will prolong his days. So that's a little odd and seems to imply could be taken to imply a resurrection. Maybe it would just imply some kind of spiritual resurrection. But so that the prophecy and all of that, then you've got not just Jesus when he's a little boy and you think he's the Messiah, but he grows up. You've got his whole ministry, the appearance that he seems to be performing other miracles, for example, his own claims to deity. You've got I often point out the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma concerning that C.S. Lewis brought forward is part of the argument for the prior of the resurrection. People don't realize that, but it actually is independent of the specific evidence for the resurrection. It's this trilemma that he claimed to be God. He'd have to be crazy, or he'd have to be bad, and so forth, or he really was God. That increases the prior of the resurrection. So when you bring all of that in, then of course what you're doing at the same time is raising the probability of the existence of God also. Right. So these things, you're not going to just keep the prior of the existence of God at 50 as you're adding these other evidences. It's rising too with all of this other specific evidence. So let's get to the crucifixion, right? Jesus is dead. Holy Saturday. What's the prior probability of the resurrection? And at that point, I'm willing to say it could very, very plausibly, for those who know all of this specific evidence, be above 0.5.
Excellent. Anything else to that point, Tim?
Nope,
We're
that sounds good to
satisfied.
me.
We're satisfied. We didn't talk too much about Hume. Was there anything else we wanted to say about Hume's general argument?
Well, let me say just one thing about it, because it intersects with something we've discussed already. Hume's essay of miracles is divided into two parts. The first part has what I would say is an attempted a priori argument. Miracles are violations of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are the most massively empirically supported things that we could have. Whatever empirical evidence you've got for a miracle, it's not going to overwhelm that evidence, so you're on the losing side to start with. Then in part two, he makes a lot of specific arguments, which were mostly not original with him. But one of the things that he does that sets the stage for people like Allison is he considers parallel miracle claims. And again, he gives this fake appearance of being even-handed by saying, well, you wouldn't believe that the Emperor Vespasian actually cured a blind man and a lame man, so why would you believe that Jesus did it? You wouldn't believe that this man's leg was restored by the rubbing of holy oil, then why would you believe that Jesus did healings? You wouldn't believe the claims of the people at the tomb of the Abbey Paris, but the evidence there is just as good as your evidence here. And the answer to all such parallel claims is, great, I'm glad that you're making some arguments, but actually your evidence is terrible. And this is what people like George Campbell and William Adams and John Douglas did in response to Hume within Hume's own lifetime. They dug into his evidence. They said, okay, the miracles of healing with the convulsionaries at the tomb of the Abbey Paris, you're relying solely on Moncaron's account. Let's go dig into that. And they did dig into it, and they showed that Hume is just talking nonsense when he says the evidence here is really good or is as strong as you could imagine. No evidence could conceivably be the weaker than for some of these things. And so, sure, when somebody brings up a parallel, it's fine for us to roll up our sleeves and look at it. The mere fact that someone has brought up something and claimed that it's a parallel does not put it on the same epistemic footing. Right. It does not mean that it's entitled to equal consideration or equal time. It's hard to go into that because that requires that we look at details.
Yes.
And details are messy. Mm-hmm. So we wind up having to roll up our sleeves and get into this. A lot of people who engage in these discussions would much rather stand up on some kind of philosophical Mount Olympus and hurl down thunderbolts. But that's not where the interesting things happen. The interesting things happen in the thicket of special questions when we're looking at the details of these things. So Hume is a precursor of Dale Allison in exactly that respect.
I want to say something, though, here, which is that I think Allison gives more detail himself than Hume ever did. And I think that's helpful to us because Allison is trying to put the case, to take the rainbow body example, fairly strongly. He's trying to represent the strength of that evidence. And so for example, what he'll emphasize is that the account came within a short time of the person's death. So that's one of the filters that Tim brought up, for example, or that it was made by the person's son, for example. So that would have been someone, close to the facts. So these are some things, these are relevant considerations, and he'll give quotations from the people who said that they witnessed this, or they found the body missing, or whatever. And I think that goes some distance. And so I've known of people who consider what Allison's doing to be very challenging, and they'll say, the McGrews have not gone and read the original accounts. It's like, well, I mean, Allison's giving a pretty big quote, from the original accounts. It's more than David Hume ever did. And he's giving summaries of what he considers to be presumably the strongest points in favor of these, and in favor of putting them on more or less a par with the resurrection. And I mean, if there's some secret evidence that he's got that shows how strong this is, I wish he'd bring it forward. But when you've read the passages and the discussion, the chapter in the book, I think that is actually ought to be a fair enough approach to say, okay, this is my problem. These people, you're not even claiming that these people faced significant danger of death. You're not claiming that. You're in fact discounting that. You're not taking that into account even for the Gospels, for example. You're just ignoring that. You're also promoting a kind of principle of credulity, where either you've just got to believe what somebody says, or you've got to not believe what somebody says. And you're actually trying to cram that down our throats and insist we've got to go one way or another for both of these counts. Well, that's wrong. That's epistemically wrong. Okay, so they went and they found, they had his body covered up, and then they went and they unlocked the door and they removed the cloth and the body was gone. Well, I mean, so what? That's not similar. Or, there was a case where this person said he had a vision of his father after his father had, I think it was his father or his guru, his master, after his master had achieved rainbow body. Well, but it wasn't a vision that looked like he was physically risen from the dead, like the ones in the Gospels. So again, you're ignoring the details of the Gospels. You can make those comparisons without my going out there, going to Allison's footnote, finding the entire work from which it is taken, getting it on interlibrary loan, and reading the assertions over and over and over again, of which presumably his quotations are meant to be representative. So when we talk about getting into details, I want to be careful that doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's got to be some stronger evidence out there than what the advocate himself has put forward, and it's your responsibility to go find it and then answer it. And the McGrews admit that they haven't read anything but Allison's chapter. Well, yeah, I admit that, and I admit to being unimpressed. Go ahead, Tim. You wanted to say something?
Two things. First of all, you'd be surprised at how many things we do get on interlibrary loan and track down. So we have to triage these requests. The folks at the Eastwood branch of the Kalamazoo Library are quite familiar with us at this point. And so there are a lot of things that we do go and chase down, and we have to be selective in how much we do on any one topic. When it comes to the rainbow bodies, I think we have every reason to say Allison is presumably putting his best foot forward on this. And the very absence, by his own description, of a critical context of people who would be willing to investigate into this and would have the evidence at their fingertips. He says these people don't want to talk about the evidence with outsiders. Well, that kind of does make it hard for there to be an inquiry, and that is itself a reason to doubt this. And it's one of the reasons that among all of the other things that we do try to chase down, among all the other footnotes that we do go look up and place orders of the books and have a look at them, this is not one that we are rushing out to do. If someone presented more extensive quotations that made a better case, we'd probably go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and that's and one other thing that I'll just add to this to other miracle claims is that in a sense, not all senses, but in a sense, it's kind of like so what, because they're not necessarily competing, right? Like a miracle of healing, even if there's not great evidence, like sure, like yeah, maybe that happened, right? But what does that what does that what does that what does that prove, right? It just proves that somebody had a miracle of healing, right?
It kind of would depend on the context. I mean, if somebody said he had a miracle of healing and he was promoting himself as a way to God and was promoting an entire other worldview, which I would argue Buddhism and Christianity are incompatible.
Correct, yeah.
So if he's promoting an actually incompatible worldview, then in that sense they are at least weakly competing, because you can argue that God would be unlikely to bring forward his power to appear to endorse the claims of an incompatible set of propositions. So there is that. And now you could think in terms of like demonic events, but I definitely don't think that's what's going on with the rainbow bodies. There might be some where I wouldn't necessarily say healing, but certainly appearances of possession, demonic possession, and so forth. That's actually well accommodated within Christianity.
That's an important thing that I brought up before, is that Christianity has explanatory resources that I think often need to be considered, and you've just hinted at one of them, right? That can explain a number of phenomena. Whether or not people like those explanations is to my mind irrelevant, because that is a part of Christianity. If we have other reasons for thinking that Christianity is true, there's no reason not to consider those explanatory resources, right? Yeah. So my I guess my point was, yeah, I absolutely agree, right? If the miracle claim is attached to some type of endorsement, then we do have competition. But I guess I don't see an issue in just a general sense of like a miraculous healing, even if it happens outside of a Christian context. So yeah, we would just want more specifics, right, of some of these things. I think that's all you guys have been asking for. It's like, give us the specifics, give us the details. Very good. Okay, next one is this. Buckham agrees with literary fiction devices, but much of his work seems to overlap with the McGrews. He rejects passage-by-passage analysis and has pointed towards archaeology as an external test. So maybe you, too, if you understand this question, could give some background of what's being talked about here.
Well, he's talking about Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham. It's an interesting question to what extent Bauckham actually endorses the literary fictionalizing devices phenomenon. I think he probably endorses some of them. In fact, interestingly, he even thinks that in Elie Wiesel's, I think it's Night, Wiesel is attributing a quotation to his father, they can do anything they want, that his father didn't really say, in order to make a point about, I don't know, without God, anything is permissible, that he's like alluding to Solzhenitsyn there. And I think Wiesel's father just actually said they can do whatever they want. So it isn't even just about the Gospels. I think Bauckham himself was probably originally coming from a more liberal perspective, and then his own work on the eyewitnesses and Jesus and the Eyewitnesses has brought him to a point where his work tends to overlap a lot of conservative work. I also think that Bauckham has probably not gone back and investigated the classical background to some of these claims about the devices that were permitted and so forth. I think he's taking some people's word for it. In fact, I think there is to some extent a line going, Scholar A says he's argued for this and gets a book published by Oxford University Press, and then Scholar B, who's like really, really eminent, accepts what Scholar A has said, and then Richard Bauckham looks at Scholar B and says, well, I'm so glad Scholar B is here to tell us how much flexibility was allowed in this genre, and I'm pretty much the only person out there who's gone back to the underlying research that Scholar A did and said it's terrible. So Bauckham's a classicist, and I would like to think he's kind of a hard-headed guy and a hard-nosed guy. I would like to think that at least for some of these things, if he had the time and took the time to read, for example, The Mirror or the Mask, which I wrote, and to look at some of the underlying arguments, he would be willing to say, oh man, that's a terrible argument, oh wow, that's a blunder, ooh, ouch, ooh, and so forth. But as far as I know, he's never done it. And he's a busy guy and may just consider me a priori to be too conservative, and for that reason be less inclined to take that underlying spade work that I've done seriously. In the meanwhile, I think when we approach Balcom's own work, we just, pick and choose like we do with any other scholar, and take the stuff that seems to hold up and not take the stuff that doesn't seem to hold up, including things that might seem to support our own view. Like I would love to accept Balcom's theory that there's something called an inclusio of witness testimony. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what that is, but it's supposed to be a way that the Gospels subtly and indirectly indicate that they are eyewitness testimony. And I said, no, this is cherry picking. When I read Balcom's argument for it, I said, oh shoot, I'd like that, but it's actually, I think it's an illusion. I don't think there is an inclusio of witness testimony. So I try to do this both with the stuff I like in Balcom and the stuff I antecedently am inclined against.
Let me just follow up on what Lydia said there, because I used to take at face value some of the things that Balcom and some of the people that Balcom has read were saying, rather as he took some of them at face value and then had to gradually abandon that. So there are even some earlier talks and lectures of mine out there on YouTube where I would, in all innocence, say some of these things about inclusio, for example, or about the range of presentation that was permissible in Crea, thinking that I knew what I meant by the claims, and it turns out that wasn't what the original people meant by them, or thinking that the original people had better evidence than in fact it's turned out they did. So there are even some changes I have had to make in the direction of not saying certain things that I was initially in all innocence inclined to just borrow from other scholars. The borrowing thing has not panned out well. And this is something that Lydia and I have been working through in the past dozen years or so, that there are things that people said very confidently that seemed like they were right on the surface. And then when we delved into them, we discovered, no, they're not. And so that's one of the reasons that I said with regard to The Mirror or the Mask, that this is the book that contains the arguments that changed my mind on some of these issues.
Well, yeah. You know what? That now I have a question, because you say, you're doing a lot of work since the article was published originally with the companion. It's kind of just more of a personal question, but do you feel more confident in your argument now that you've done all this other work on gospel reliability, or do you feel you're about the same or less confident? Like where do you think it stands now in relation to when you originally published it? Just from your guys' perspective. Yeah.
I would say that the mountain of evidence that we've continued to excavate as we've been working on this through the past dozen years has tended, if anything, to confirm both our confidence and the general correctness of the approach that we use there to say, let's make a more robust case. Let's take our stand on the credibility of the gospel testimonies. Let's not try to do all of this from St. Paul. Let's not just try to say, oh, yeah, without the Gospels, we'll just do 1 Corinthians 15, the early creed. The early creed is interesting. It's there, but we would rather hold the forward position. And the sort of mountain of evidence that we have come to see there has really, if anything, only solidified our conviction that our faith is very well founded indeed.
Excellent.
I would say that I'm convinced on a far more solid basis now of the assumption that this is what the witnesses claimed. So we've sort of, gone down into the skeptical literature and the critical scholarly literature, recognized that the consensus of scholarship doesn't grant this, absorbed the impact of this, and then gone and developed my own ideas in an independent way that has given me something that's stronger to stand on than ever before for that assumption. Now, as far as the Bayes factor that we did in that article, that was based on a particular calculation where we took, I believe, 13. Probably the biggest part of it was the 13 witnesses, which would have been the disciples, the 11, that would be, and then Matthias, who was chosen as a replacement for Judas, and James. So that's where the 13 comes in, 11 plus 2. And then the testimony of the women was treated as one factor over here. And I think what I would do now, another thing that I've done a huge amount of work on is independence, because one of the neat things about that article was that we developed certain probabilistic ideas that had never been developed in just those terms before in secular probability theory. And Tim originally developed the insight for that with a certain inequality we have in there, but then I took it and I ran with it, and I published a whole series of secular probability articles based on investigating the implications of that. And so I think I would probably do the independence somewhat differently now, where I would break up the women, somewhat, and I wouldn't necessarily count the 13 disciples equally, or the 13 men equally, probably, or I might do it as independent, partially independent claimed encounters or something like that, rather than counting noses of people. The Bayes factor, if I did that, might not end up quite as high. On the other hand, there are other people we didn't even talk about there. Like, we didn't even talk about the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, for example. We didn't even mention those guys, and they apparently claimed that they had an experience of Jesus. So, and like I said, we treated all the women as a lump instead of breaking out Mary Magdalene or talking about Joanna separately or that kind of thing. And there are considerations of independence there, which I've explored a little bit in a blog post I did just in the last year or 2, I believe, on the conspiracy hypothesis, but it has implications for other hypotheses as well, with the differing social pressures that would have come onto these people to recant their testimony and so forth, and not to just piggyback off of other people. So, some people's Bayes factor would be higher. I think, Mary Magdalene's would be higher because we have more details of what she said she experienced and so forth. But then there would be, in a sense, more of them. How that would all cash out, I do still think that the Bayes factor would be comparable. It might be somewhat less, or it might be somewhat more. So that might be a way in which I would change things, partly as a result of the work that I've done on independence in the years since then.
Fascinating. Well, you two have been extremely generous with your time, but why don't we do one more here, because I think this might be a good one to just leave people with, and give us a chance to promote your work as well. This one comes from Brandon. He says, here's a last question. What book from your catalog would you suggest to a newbie to help understand the basic arguments in favor of the resurrection? Now, of course, promote all your books, but maybe emphasize one that you think would be like the best one to begin with for Brandon here. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, I'm the one who's written the books, which is a little unfair because Tim introduced me to the argument from undesigned coincidences. He was enthusiastic about it before there was even, before I knew about it. He brought it to me. He encouraged me, and then I wrote the book instead of him, which is sad in a way. But I think I dedicated it. Did I dedicate it to you? I think I did. Anyway, so none of the books focus entirely on the resurrection. None of the books that I've written focus entirely on the resurrection. So in that sense, that makes it a little hard to answer the question. I tend to think that Hidden in Plain View is the most lay-friendly of the 3 books that I have written. So, and I talk, especially in the afterword, about the implications for the resurrection argument, and I sprinkle things through there. It's not comprehensive by any means, right. But in that sense, I would encourage people to start with Hidden in Plain View. I would also include people to subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I'm often, like, I have a 20-minute YouTube video in which, unfortunately, the telephone rings, but try to overlook that. That gives the case for the resurrection in 20 minutes. You can find that one out there. It's going to take a lot less time than reading a book. Or if you get the Mirror or the Mask, you can focus in on the section on the resurrection accounts and claimed discrepancies in the resurrection account. So I've tried to index everything in a way that makes it easy to find the information that you want. Then, of course, there are historical books that were written by neither of us. And Tim is the great expert on that. Tim, is there a single historical, one of those old guys books that you would suggest that someone who just wants to get into this as a newbie should go out and read, that's going to be reader friendly?
Wow. So I've already mentioned Paley's View of the Evidences, and I think that's an outstanding piece of work. There's also John Kennedy, he's got a book on the resurrection. That's one of the older ones. James Orr has a book on the resurrection. So what I'll do is I'll actually send Pat links to some of these sources so that he can put them up in the show notes. And then if you want to go and pursue any of these, the older works are all copyright free. They're in the public domain. So you can download these and read anything you like. And I really do recommend getting into some of these older works. They will show you that the arguments that are today being put forward are nothing new. The old ornaments of deism have been broken off and cast into the fire, and behold, there came out modern critical scholarship. But really, there's not a lot that's new there. And so it's worth having a look at some of these older works in order to see how they engaged with things. So I will give Pat copies of or links to Kennedy and Orr and Paley, and then encourage you to go exploring. And we're not hard to get a hold of. You can find Lydia's contact information on her webpage, lydiamcgrew.com. You can find my contact information on my webpage, timothymcgrew.com. So you can come and look us up, and you can reach out to us, and we're happy to entertain questions, and we can maybe fine-tune our bibliographical recommendations from there.
I would also maybe recommend one of the books. Is it Douglas, The Criterion, that gives some of those filters that you talked about earlier today, that by which we can know that we're not being overly credulous about a miracle claim.
That'd be tremendous, and I'll link all that in the show notes, both on YouTube and on my website, Chronicles of Strength, once the podcast episode goes up. Cool. Before we close out here, just any final summary thoughts that either two of you have, and then give us a tease or a promotion of anything that you're working on in the future that we have that we can look forward to from the McGrews.
Subscribe to my YouTube channel.
We'll link that too. Yeah, we'll link all that good stuff. Yep.
For sure.
Yeah. If you're interested in the sweep of apologetics, the range of it in contemporary practice, the history of it, then keep your eyes peeled. There might be a book project in the works that would have to do with that. So you say, give me a tease. There you go. I'll tease you with that.
Beautiful. Excellent. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. Again, we'll have all the good stuff in the show notes. Definitely immediately head over to Lydia's YouTube channel. Subscribe to that. Just incredible content. Boy, I love talking with both of you. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Pat.